to see Ms. Monica Marvin. I know most of you here, but for those of you that I don't, I serve as the Associate Director of the University of Michigan Genetic Counseling Program. And on behalf of Bev Yashar and myself, we're really excited to welcome you to the 9th Annual Diane Baker Alumni Lecture. Today we'll be honoring Elizabeth Kearney, a 1996 graduate of the University of Michigan Genetic Counseling Program. This is really one of my favorite events of the year because it celebrates our alumni. And while there's a lot of things I really love about my job, one of the things I love the most is to see the outstanding accomplishments that our alumni make. Another real highlight of this event every year for me is the opportunity to get to see Diane Baker back in town. Because Diane actually trained all of the recipients of the Diane Baker Alumni Award to date, as well as training myself, Bev, and Wendy, it's really fitting that she's here to actually present the award to Liz today. Before she does, I did want to take a moment to recognize Diane. Diane spent about 25 years here within the Department of Human Genetics. In addition to her role as the first genetic counseling program director, Diane also provided genetic counseling in pediatric genetics. She administered the state's newborn screening program, coordinated outreach clinics in northern Michigan, and provided outreach to local teachers and students. During her tenure as program director, Diane served as an educator, a mentor, and a true inspiration to her students, her colleagues, and her patients. In the field of genetic counseling, Diane's reach has extended beyond the University of Michigan, as she's served in leadership positions in essentially all of the major clinical genetics societies. She was also instrumental in the 2008 passage of the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. Diane hasn't slowed down since leaving Ann Arbor, and organizations like Friends of the Patients at the NIH, the Genetic Alliance, Big Brothers and Big Sisters, PXC International, and court-appointed Special Advocates for Children are all organizations that are really fortunate to have Diane's contributions. So Diane continues to be a generous, kind, and humble soul, and I'm really thrilled to have her with us today to introduce Elizabeth Kearney.
Thank you, Monica. It's wonderful to be back here with the Maize and Blue and back with all of you and celebrating this event and the alumni at the University of Michigan. So let me tell you a little bit about Liz. Academically, she got her undergraduate degree at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Bachelor of Science in Genetics, Phi Beta Kappa, and National Science Scholar. She then came to the University of Michigan. She joined us here to enter the Human Genetics program and receive her genetic counseling training, and that was awarded in 1996. And then in 2006, Liz did something that is still rather unique for our field, which is she became dual degreed. She went back to school, and she went to the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University to receive her MBA in Marketing, Strategy, and Health Industry Management. And she has been an incredibly busy person also, applying all these skills. She has also served in many capacities with the National Society of Genetic Counseling, including as president. So I want to share a few of her awards with you. She was the LifeScan Rookie of the Year Marketing Award. Now, who in genetic counseling gets anything like that? The NSGC Strategic Leader Award, she's been a recipient of. The Verisight Sales and Marketing Leadership Award, and today is receiving the University of Michigan Diane Baker Alumni Award. So it has been a pleasure to have worked with and known Liz as an entering student, as a graduate, as a thriving and accomplished professional. She has worked in the clinic, she has worked in the boardroom. She has been involved in healthcare delivery, and she's worked for companies that provide healthcare delivery. She's grounded in a medical specialty, and she's an entrepreneur. She is disciplined, thoughtful, deeply informed, and delightfully unpredictable. Liz, would you join me up here and with Monica? We're going to present her award. Thank you. Now, There's more.
We have just little gifts, and I know that's Diane's because she actually has mail that came to you here in the department earlier in the week. So we'll switch this.
While she's pulling that up, I just want to thank you, Diane, for that lovely introduction. Such a warm way to be welcomed back to my alma mater. And just to tell you how honored I am to be recognized with an award of this significance. I think of leadership as a ripple effect, and that one person can have a broad impact through their impact on other people. Excuse me. And I think about my training here at the Human Genetics Department in that way, and the breadth of skills from psychosocial counseling skills to being rooted very deeply in scientific method, and have used all of that across I've been fortunate enough to have a broad range of opportunities in my career. And I thank the department, and I thank Diane for your mentorship over the years, not just when I was a student, but throughout my career, and can only hope that I can have that ripple effect that the department and Diane have had on me. So just incredibly honored to be here today. And in thinking about a topic for today's lecture, I thought about my career and that I've often worked around the boundaries of the profession and perhaps had some influence over its evolution. So I wanted to choose a forward-looking topic and do some perhaps crystal ball work and thinking about where the profession may go in the future. And I am simultaneously celebrating a different milestone right now, in that I moved to the San Francisco Bay Area 20 years ago, and I started for my first genetic counseling position in California on September 1, 1998, so 20 years ago. And it was the absolute height of what we call the .com boom. And so I moved to this crazy place called California, and as a Wisconsin girl, and I was meeting new people who were working in the .com field, and they were working at these internet companies. And I watched this all and heard about their exciting jobs and, getting free massages and free lunches and the crazy place that it was at the time, and was feeling a little bit like I was not adventurous enough because I was working in healthcare. And then 2 years later, they all got fired. So then I knew I actually was the brilliant one, choosing to work in healthcare. But hopefully this won't surprise anyone, but although most of those companies went out of business, the internet actually made it. And right now in the Bay Area, I'm watching this AI hype that's happening, and there's all this talk about it, lots of investment, and I feel like I've seen the movie before, and I know how it's going to end. A lot of these companies probably aren't going to make it, but we're probably looking at a paradigm shift in how we do work, and that AI may have a similar type of role in the future that the internet does for us today, and it's really just integrated into everything that we do. But if that's not enough for thinking about AI, and if you're not thinking about moving into science fiction, some other reasons to think about it is it's just a cool party trick to know about AI. Everybody's talking about it. But more seriously, there's lots of students here, and I'm sure anyone in the room today has some role of working with students. And for those of you, AI is likely to have a big impact on your careers and how you move forward. It's also really important to have an influence on how genetic service delivery evolves and not leave it only to the technology firms to define that path. And for people who are thinking about future career opportunities and transitions, lots of ways to approach that by knowing about AI. But I think the number one reason to explore AI and its implications on genetic service delivery is that it's already happening. So we really should understand how it's being used and what its limitations are. So what I'm going to do is spend, excuse me, a little bit of time going over a background on AI, because I think it's important for us to get on the same page. Lots of different backgrounds in the room, and people think about AI in different ways. And then I'll give some examples of applications, and then we can get to that prediction of where things may go in the future. So as I said, people think about AI in really different ways. And I think the general public and what we're hearing in the media conjures up certain images from popular culture. And just so I kind of know who's in the room, who's seen 2001: Space Odyssey? Okay, so most of the audience. So this is a classic film, obviously, and very apocalyptic in tone. And there's other movies like this, and it is modeling an idea of, the AI being like human thought and really able to mimic human thought. And when you talk to people who work in the AI industry, so statisticians, computational biologists, et cetera, as soon as they hear that comment, they'll say, so that's what we call general AI, and we're a long way from being able to do that. So I think it's important to put that in perspective and think about where AI really is today. And some definitions of AI can be as simple as thinking of an agent that's able to perceive its environment and react to it and optimize its outcomes. In many ways, thinking about like computer games and things like that, and how a computer would play against a human. But the reality of it is that we're actually surrounded by AI already in our daily lives. It's just some of those things are so familiar to us and so much a part of our lives that we don't necessarily think about it as AI. Instead, we go more to the movies and such. But lots of examples, natural language processing, and so the ability to read or understand language from word that is spoken is an AI technique. Search algorithms that serve up results are based on AI. We, of course, hear about robotics in industry, and we're hearing about some of the more exciting breakthroughs that aren't quite out there yet, like autonomous driving. But to try to get a better definition of AI, it's also important to think about it historically. And DARPA, which is a US agency that, for those of you who don't know, works on kind of the out there projects like the internet and GPS and things like that, and now working on AI, has defined 3 waves of AI. And the first one, many people working in the AI field, I think, and in popular culture today, don't even think about this as AI anymore. Maybe because it feels old school. It's been around a lot longer, but these are the programmed rules. And then the computer, using those rules, will make predictions around outcomes or try to optimize. And for whatever reason, I think of airline scheduling when I think of this. And probably why part of the reason I'm able to get, as soon as I land, my rescheduled itinerary when a flight's been canceled is in partly due to these kinds of programs. These programs are still out there. They're very powerful. There's lots of applications of them that are still being used. But we tend to think more about later waves of AI when we hear about it. Wave 2 being statistical learning or machine learning, where, and there's some examples listed on the screen, but this is where we're getting a collection of inputs, and then the computer is mapping those inputs to possible outputs. So I like to think of a basketball game, and if I was wanting to know, picking a fan out of the stands, what is that person playing for my team or for the opposing team? Some things I might look at might be the colors that they're wearing. Do they have any insignia on their clothes? Do they smile or clap when my team scores? Those all might be possible inputs, but you can imagine at any one time, it could be a little bit different. Maybe the person wasn't paying attention when my team scored. So the machine learning that's happening is mapping all of those inputs to those 2 possible outputs, either my team or the opposing team. And it's predicting a probability that, that the fan is on my team, is rooting for my team. And so this has a lot of power, and it is very good at classifying results, but not necessarily doing what happened in wave 1, where it's able to then model out from there possible pathways and optimization. So the third wave that's emerging right now is to actually have the computer be able to build modeling so that it can go back and, in a sense, train itself and able to be more responsive to real-world phenomenon. So in that way, this emerging area of AI would be more powerful in being able to combine all of those outputs. So that statistical learning is, as I mentioned, machine learning, and a subcategory of machine learning is deep learning. And I think if you don't remember anything else, if you're new to AI and you don't remember anything else about what I present today, I would remember this diagram. I think it's a nice way of having a representation of what deep learning is doing. So along the, let me see if I can get, along the left-hand side here are, many could have many, many inputs. And then on the right-hand side, this is getting mapped to outputs. But instead of just a small number of statistical associations, I think of it like statistics on steroids, that there's many, many layers that can happen in deep learning at a level that we as humans would never be able to make all of those statistical associations and to map a pathway from inputs to outputs, but the computer is able to do that. Just showing you an example of how this is used in robotics to show you a video of it. So in this experiment, the researchers have laid out a bunch of objects, and the robot is got a choice of two outputs, which is to either use a clasper to pick it up or to use a suction cup. And so the robot is trying those different approaches and determining which classification to put it in, so that it learns that, well, the little Toyota, that's easier to pick up with the clasp, and I guess I hit those at the same time, and this mustard bottle is a little bit easier to pick up with the suction cup. This is a chart that just gives you a sense of the momentum that's happening in this space. So these are startup companies that were funded in Q1 of this year, and so the number represents the number of companies started and funded. And if it says general by it, that means it's core technology, where the company's actually working on underlying AI technology, and then everything else is an application. I think this is important because I actually went back and looked 2 years in 2016, and it is the reversal in trend. So most of the companies funded in early 2016 were core technology, whereas it feels like we've already shifted to seeing more application. And healthcare is a big area of this. Oops. This is a heat map of different industries and the amount of investment that's happening in them, and you see that healthcare is right there at the top. And just to give you some examples that are of AI applications that are happening outside of genomics, I'll list a few here. Now, this is just a small number of examples. But medical imaging and pathology is an area that has been targeted for AI applications as something very amenable to machine learning. If you think about it, it makes sense because you have lots of cases where pathologists or radiologists have made a diagnosis, and you have the images that they've looked at, and you have their diagnosis. So you can put that through, train the machine on that set of data, and then have the machine apply it to other new cases. Now, there's lots of arguments in this space. It lends itself to AI. Radiologists and pathologists are already pretty good at making diagnoses, so there's some arguments in the AI field about just because it's a place where the machine learning is, could be applied very well, that doesn't necessarily mean it's the best application. Oops, I did want to show a couple more of these. So one of the really interesting ones to me is treatment and counseling for anxiety and depression. And there's a number of different applications in this space. And some examples of how it's used are for individuals who have been diagnosed and are being managed, that they can use an app, basically, that has a combination of detecting from their cell phone activity, sometimes from inputs that they put in, and then using a chatbot to use interventions of using based on cognitive behavioral therapy. So what they're doing isn't therapy per se, but it is helping that individual in a moment of risk and perhaps helping that person to convert what might be negative thoughts into more positive ones. It's a very interesting application. And chronic disease management, so with kidney disease using dialysis data, and again, data perhaps from wearables and from other sources, even from their own activities on their cell phones, possibly making medication recommendations. And in diabetes management, to again think about interventions at key moments, which might be around meals and so on. And I had an interesting conversation with a former colleague of mine from J&J, who's a diabetes educator, and she works at a company working on an application like this. And one of the things she said that has kind of stuck with me is, you know, Liz, we've never been able to follow our patients home. And yet, in diabetes, much of the key decisions that are being made around management are not when that person is in their office. And so having interventions that can help them with making decisions around using their using their continuous blood glucose monitoring, as well as, you know, pictures of food, et cetera, like that, they'll maybe be able to make better decisions about managing their diabetes. I also, on the right-hand side, just want to point out, don't have to go through the details, but just point out there's lots of applications to the business of healthcare in using AI. So the suits in the boardroom, in the hospital system, may definitely be exploring where there's applications as well. And, you know, just to point out, I mean, it's interesting to think about with insurance claim processing, you know, if the billing office can use machine learning to say, hey, this particular claim, there's a 50% chance that this will get reimbursed. But if you add, let's say, Form C, that probability goes up to 80%. Those kinds of programs are out there and may have a very big impact on healthcare, even if some of them are not exclusive to the healthcare industry and not involved in patient care. So these are some of the opportunities, but obviously we want to think about what are the limitations. So I took this from a paper written by a professor and AI researcher at NYU. And I'll just acknowledge, first of all, I made up the terms along the left for the most part, just to make them a little more accessible. But the paper has definitely had its critics. And I would say the primary thrust of that criticism is that we're working on this. That there's lots of smart people trying to come up with ways to better manage these limitations, and that progress is being made. I still think it's helpful to go through these and understand that these limitations are out there. So AI is really greedy. Lots and lots of data. So for machine learning to work, you often need tens of thousands of data points, if not millions. And shallow. So we as humans understand what concepts are, even something as abstract as democracy. We have an understanding of what that means. But a simple concept, even like a wall, isn't something necessarily that machine learning is understanding. So it may, in a video game, figure out that it gets more points if it goes over or under, but that doesn't mean that it fundamentally understands what a wall is. So it's flat, so it can't deal with hierarchy. So when we read something, when we're learning as students, we're able to look at a sentence and understand this is the main phrase of a sentence. This other point is a supportive point, but machine learning is going to look at those things as equal. The black box issue, opaqueness, is a real problem. You could especially think in medicine this is a problem, is that we don't necessarily know how machine learning is doing all those associations. If you think of that diagram that I showed a few minutes ago. And again, people are working on this, but it is a limitation. implicit information and past experience as humans, we're able to pull that all in. If that hasn't been part of a data set, the machine learning, it's not going to be part of the algorithm. And then, of course, correlation is not causation. This is statistics, basically, that's being done. So there's nothing new here. We've known that about statistics, but it is something we have to consider as a limitation. And inflexible, so not liking the variability of the real world. Stock market. Wouldn't it be great if we could use machine learning to predict the stock market? But there's so many new variables that get introduced that even using historical data is unlikely to make accurate predictions. And naive. So AI researchers love to try to fool their own programs. And so when they write a program, they'll then turn around and try and find ways to fool it. And an example, for example, in autonomous driving would be maybe the machine is very good at recognizing a stop sign, but then if you deface the stop sign, perhaps it ends up thinking it's a speed limit sign. Now, I think of risks of AI as different from limitations of AI. So these are the bad outcomes that could possibly happen. And kind of going back to 2001 Space Odyssey, we have this fear of machines taking over. And there's this if you remember in the movie, there's that very creepy moment where Hal says, "I'm sorry, Dave, I can't do that." So that's a very frightening image that we have. It's interesting to ask people who work in the AI field what they see as the risks. And there was an interesting survey done of AI researchers. These were mostly PhDs at universities who focus on this area, and they were asked about the biggest risks in the first 20 years and then 100 years. And I just put up this pie chart of what their comments were for 20 years. And you can see the biggest chunk is actually one that's around economic consequences. So widening of the rich-poor gap and possibly widespread unemployment. But they certainly have concerns about other areas too, such as weaponry and things like that. So those are the kind of comments that they make as the experts. I just want to put a note on regulation. FDA has come out with some guidance on this, and especially around just digital health and health tools in general, but certainly AI would fall in that category. And we're probably looking at this software being considered a medical device, so needing to go through the right pathway. There's some interesting questions to ask around quality and how do we assure that manufacturers of this kind of software are high quality to be applied in medicine. And then what's the standard? So do these tools need to, we know that mistakes happen in medicine, always have. Do the tools need to be better? Or are we looking for parity? So we're aiming more for efficiency? Or are they tools to be used in that there should always be a human in the loop? And then perhaps they don't need to be quite as good. So these are all really interesting questions to explore. So with that background, I want to go through a few examples of AI being applied in genomics. And the first one is really important, is variant interpretation. So this is happening. Labs are using AI applications, and it makes a lot of sense to apply AI in this setting because of the vast amount of data. I mean, where are the best places to think about AI? You'll often hear people say, well, where are humans good at things and where are they maybe not so good at things? And the not so good tends to be categories like just vast amounts of data that we can't necessarily get our heads around, or rote activities that are repetitive. So there's a lot of data to go through for variant interpretation. And that doesn't mean that the variant scientist is out of a job. We're really looking at, human in the loop kinds of opportunities here. But what's happening is the AI applications are being used to search databases, search the literature, serving up as part of an algorithm, here's relevant information, and sometimes even pre-populating test reports, and then the individuals in the lab taking a look at that. Test development is a big area, and I'm just going to give one example, and it's one that I just want to disclose, even though this isn't for continuing education. I do want to disclose that I worked on this product. I'm no longer financially connected in any way with them, but I worked for them from 2013 to 2015. And this was a product that, when it was introduced, was a solution for management of thyroid nodules. So what happened before the era of molecular medicine was that, when someone has a thyroid nodule, the endocrinologist will do a fine needle biopsy of the nodule, and most of the time they can tell if it's benign or malignant, and most of the time it's benign. But sometimes they're not quite sure, and they call that indeterminate. And before the era of molecular medicine, the guidelines were for that patient to go to surgery to have a thyroidectomy. And then most of the time, the surgical pathology would show that the nodule was benign. So certainly a lot of people were having a surgery that, if they had known it was benign, they wouldn't have had. And then they also don't have their thyroid anymore. So what this test did is it still went through the cytopathology pathway, but for those that were individual, they created a gene expression classifier that then was able to pull out about half of those nodules and say that they were benign, so that those people didn't need to go to surgery. Now, how did they do this? It's really important to think through the machine learning aspects of it. So they had many, many cases, again, where I described before, where they had the genomic sample on the thyroid nodule. They had RNA data, and then they had what the surgical outcome was. And so that was their data set, and they trained the machine on that. They locked the algorithm, and then critically, they did a validation. So in a large study, multi-center study, and double-blinded, and all those important things, they then applied it. It was compared to the surgical outcome in order to validate the results. And the performance of the test was high enough, its sensitivity being about 90% and a pretty high negative predictive value, so that the endocrinologists were comfortable with just following those patients who got reclassified to benign through the classifier. It's just following them by ultrasound. Now, this is just one example, but you can imagine a lot of applications for this type of an approach, where it might not be RNA, it might be another it might be other omics, it might even be other kinds of data, but helping to make diagnoses in settings where there maybe is a diagnostic dilemma. Treatment, similarly, there's been some bad press lately around like IBM Watson, but this is an application of machine learning that genomic sequencing of a tumor, again, then searching databases and published literature for possible treatments and pharmaceutical treatments and for clinical trials, and serving up those possible treatments. Like I said, this has gotten some bad press because the outcomes of the machine learning algorithm haven't always matched what the physicians in charge of the patient's care would have recommended. So it comes back to that question again of like, what is the role of the AI tool? Is it a clinical support tool? Is it supposed to replace the diagnosis and thinking through those aspects? Chatbots. So we talked about anxiety and depression and some of the interventions that can happen there. So chatbots are being used in genetic counseling. And so this has been somewhat of a recent emergence, but actually being able to do both pre-test genetic counseling and post-test genetic counseling through an interaction with a chatbot. So we're probably more familiar with chatbots being used in like retail online settings and that kind of application, but it's a similar type of approach here. And it is being used already in a clinical environment. And then software for assistance with diagnosis of inherited disease or rare disease, pointing out, symptom analysis. This has been around for a while, right? So kind of going back to my earlier point about Wave 1 AI, that there have been tools where the software developers have pre-programmed the software to provide recommendations around possible diagnoses, but this is now being replaced with machine learning, and possibly also including like patients describing their own symptoms, which is an interesting aspect in and of itself that I want to come back to. And then facial recognition, so using tools trained through machine learning to potentially serve up possible diagnoses based on facial features. And then I had to recognize the University of Michigan in the project that was being done here on pedigree analysis. And I spoke with Dana about this project for inherited eye disease and looking at classification into different inheritance patterns. They weren't literally taking a picture of a pedigree, but instead were programming that into the machine for machine learning. They were limited by data size, which I already commented on that being a real limitation for AI. But it is interesting to look at this because it is such a direct application to genetic service delivery and such a core element of that process. Okay, so like I said, the crystal ball portion of our afternoon to think about where we might see some changes happening in genetic service delivery. And in considering how to approach this, I thought about the elements of genetic counseling process and kind of breaking that down and seeing how it interacts with AI. And I'll just comment that it's a little bit contrived to think about AI separate from other technology trends. I mean, if you think about things like wearables and people sharing data across family members, I mean, things like that, there's lots of things that are influencing how services are delivered besides AI, and yet I'm still going to do it anyway, just for the purpose of the analysis. I also, because it is a common way for AI professionals to think about where to apply AI in terms of what do humans do well and what don't they do well, I thought about it that way too. Like, what do genetics professionals already do really well versus where are maybe some areas where we are more challenged, and then where might there be some efficiencies, maybe some things that are more repetitive in nature, or maybe even things we don't like to do that could be used. And again, it's so nice to be here at University of Michigan because I am using elements of genetic counseling from a guide to genetic counseling, which of course Diane was one of the early authors, and now our current faculty are the authors. So nice to be able to talk to all of you, given that. And elements of genetic counseling, everyone here knows, most likely, but just to go through them, how I'm breaking them down: information gathering, establishing a diagnosis, risk assessment, information giving, and psychological counseling and support. Now, of course, we know while we learn skills like this in isolation for the purposes of learning, they're all integrated into what we master and call genetic counseling. But again, I'm going to break it down for the purpose of analysis. So in this first category of history collection, where are there some possible opportunities? You can certainly think that tracking and identifying all of that history information could be aided with AI tools. And I thought specifically around some of the opportunities around patients sharing their way of describing symptoms, that we've always approached diagnosis by how we as clinicians describe disease, and it's interesting to think about possibly integrating that when we're able to collect information in a different way with patient-reported language and other health data. So more continuous collection and not being so dependent on that key clinical interaction, and possibly pulling that all together. Again, thinking about my friend Janice saying, we can't follow our patients home. Where can we potentially take advantage of tools to collect information? Emotional AI, I just want to comment on, these tools exist for assessing someone's state of mind based on facial expressions, and they work to a varying degree. They're being experimented with, for example, in autonomous driving to detect when a driver may be not paying attention, but they can do things like detect anxiety, your state of mind. So perhaps there is even a way to think about, we can even collect some of the more psychological aspects of history collection. So establishing a diagnosis, so key elements of this, using medical records, diagnostic testing, and physical exams. We covered some of this already. So in genetic testing, so improving variant interpretation. We use lots of other tests besides genetics when we're making a diagnosis. So imaging and pathology interpretation could be aided through AI tools. And physical exams. So, being able to do remote work, being able to take images and being able to send them, not just a facial expression, but, of other findings to be part of that analysis. Risk assessment, to me, is a really big area for exploration for AI. Gave that example of a diagnostic test, but if you really just open up your mind and think about possibilities, there's lots of room here. I mean, we've focused on single gene, highly penetrant kinds of disorders in clinical genetics, in part because of our ability to pull together and integrate data in a statistically really robust way. And now with AI tools, it's interesting to think about what might we be able to do. And with introducing wearables, and obviously lots of change here because it's not how we're used to collecting data. We don't have a lot of that history, but it's interesting to think about where we might go if we're able to integrate much more data from lifestyle, from other omics, as well as their genetic data for polygenic disorders, for example. So information giving, this is obviously a critical part of interacting with a patient, and some of this is repetitive at times, and of course it depends on the individual clinician, but there is some repetitive information that sometimes happens, and so this is an area where chatbots may be an application to potentially free up clinicians' times for the things that, again, they do better than the repetitive elements. And I also think it's interesting to think even about just record of sessions. If we spend a lot of time writing reports and things like that, if we can just have natural language processing that basically creates your consult note for you, and then you're just reviewing it again, human in the loop kind of an aspect, how could that potentially save you time? Psychological counseling and support. So here we're talking about elements like helping with coping and facilitating decision-making. And these are fundamentally human interactions. So when I think about what do humans do well and what don't they do well, this is an area humans do very well, and not an area that machines do very well. So I think this is actually the area of opportunity for clinicians to be thinking about preparing for the future. Is there any opportunity? Yeah, I think so, for AI on-demand support. We know that people struggling with chronic disease we can't follow them home, so there probably are some opportunities to provide some support outside of clinical interactions. And then, providing other resources that, as the world gets bigger and there's more and more advocacy groups and et cetera, there may be more opportunity to share that with patients. So summing this up, I really look at AI and the work that we do as clinicians as an intersection, and that these first four categories are really about enhancement. So where are there places where we can potentially make things more efficient, potentially make improvements on what we do, and are very important to have that element of human in the loop. So we're not talking about taking the clinician out of the picture, but instead perhaps extending their presence or supporting them in a different way. I really see psychological counseling and support as I said before, a fundamentally human interaction, and one that doesn't lend itself very obviously to AI, and that my personal opinion, and when I think about the future of clinical genetic services, that this is a place where I think we should really make a strategic investment in figuring out where do we deliver that service as a piece of highest importance. Who are the patients who would benefit from it, and how do we make sure that we're there for them? In general, I think this is always about balance. And of course, we're not living at a time in American culture where we're thinking a lot about balance, so things tend to be much more extremes. But that balance is the right path forward, because with some openness to opportunities in AI, there's this possibility of being much more efficient. It does mean that we can possibly improve time to diagnosis and accuracy of diagnosis. If there's places where we can truly help patients and improve patient care, I want to be open to that and look for those opportunities. At the same time, having some real caution around the limitations and the risks of AI is also equally important. And so that means things like human in the loop, that we're not relying solely on machines to do the care, that we're thinking in advance about what safeguards we should be building in to this software. And of critical importance, and I feel like this is my solid Michigan training that has me repeat this many times over, is validation, good scientific methodology behind evaluating these AI tools in their application in a clinical setting. In terms of paths forward for genetic counselors, I see two paths emerging. One is that someone's going to have to create all of these tools, and the clinical knowledge and expertise of how interactions happen with patients and the genetics expertise is certainly a fantastic place for genetic professionals to operate. And then I also think there will always be the complex cases that will need that human interaction, human in the loop aspect of it. And I think especially psychosocial complexity is an area of opportunity. So computers are useless. They only give you answers. Important for us to remember the value that we bring with human thought and human behavior, and I think really critical to make those decisions around what do humans do better. And this same NYU professor, I liked this quote that he had in his paper to close about AI. It's not a universal solvent, but simply one tool among many, a power screwdriver in a world in which we also need hammers, wrenches, and pliers, not to mention chisels and drills, voltmeters, logic probes, and oscilloscopes. I want to thank a few people who were kind enough to share their time and expertise with me when you were studying something like AI. It's emerging and evolving so quickly, you can't possibly just look at literature. You definitely need the people who are out there every day and working on it in their own environment, and people have been very generous of sharing their expertise. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any comments and thoughts that anybody wants to float for discussion.
Not taking the clinician out of the clinic, but I'm wondering in your conversations with people who are not clinicians and with people who are kind of on the front ends of AI, if that's something that you've heard them mention, or if you're ever concerned about people offering the chance of taking the clinician out and relying solely on AI in specific interactions.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point that, there are going to be balanced voices, and there will be those who say we can just replace clinicians. And so I think it's important that we move forward with regulation and with responsible approach, being aware that there will be people who push the boundaries, and it's probably naive to think that they won't. I do feel very encouraged, though, by the thoughtfulness that I have witnessed in my interactions with most AI researchers, that they're very aware of the risks and are big proponents for safeguards and things like that.
I was wondering if in your research and talking to people in AI, if you came across any studies or anything that looked at like patients' perceptions of using AI in healthcare and any concerns there were at all those that were reflected in the AI researchers' concerns.
Oh, that's a great question. I didn't look specifically at that, but I think that's a great idea, and I'm probably going to follow up on it. Thank you for the suggestion. I mean, I think the general population perception when they hear AI is like Terminator and stuff like that, and robots. My best guess would be that they don't necessarily know these tools are being used in their approach, but I haven't looked, so thank you for the suggestion. Yeah.
It's not hard for me, and I'm sure for most of us in the room, to think of many basic science applications where AI would be very, very useful to address some of the complexities that we don't quite understand yet. So I'm aware of some trials and forays into that area, but do you have any experience with that or any examples to share?
It's a great point. So he's commenting on basic science applications. I actually think there's probably more in that area. And one of the biggest ones, drug discovery. So maybe not quite basic science, but more bench science, and anything from searching for just incredibly speeding up the process that has been traditional for drug development in finding molecules in the first place. So searching literature for possible targets, modeling of interactions, and I think there's some other applications that I probably have to review. But that's a great point. Other basic science applications aren't coming to mind right now, but I think, please share, yeah.
Complexities of DNA methylation and what it really means. And just one example, you take this to chromatin, chromosome structure and function, questions in development, but it's going to require luring these hot shots away from Silicon Valley to address those questions, right? But I don't know of any programs that you made that are giving you a degree in AI. I mean, where does one get trained in AI, or is it part of the program development in many universities under a different name?
Yeah, my impression of it is it's spread out, that you have computational biologists and you have, statistics departments, but it's being kind of all spread out across various specialties rather than like it's a degree in AI. I could be wrong about that, but that's the impression I've had. Yeah.
So how should medical education take account of the potentially changing roles of humans in a human AI system, particularly when the things that are really easy to test are the things that AI is going to be really good at, and therefore that we might not need to focus on as much as human doctors?
Can you repeat the last part of that?
It's like the things that are really easy to test are things like memorizing a bunch of knowledge and diagnosing things, and that's the kind of stuff that AI is going to be really good at, and things that are harder to test are the things that AI is going to be worse at and humans are going to be comparatively better at. So to the extent that testing matters, and maybe it doesn't, there's a lean in one direction.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of our challenges in medicine, so there's a lot of even entire conferences that are focused on like human-machine interaction in the AI field, and I think one of our challenges in medicine is cultural. And if you think about how long AI has been used in some other industries like robotics in the auto industry or in space exploration, the aerospace industry, those kinds of things, there's a culture of certainly evaluating and testing, but those tools are integrated and used. I think in medicine, we may have a cultural difference in perhaps the pushback about, like the clinician. So I think that might be one of the bigger barriers potentially. So it's related to your question, I think, in the sense of like, how do we educate? It's probably around better understanding, what really like I said, everybody says we're a long way from general AI. And yet that's somewhat of what people have in mind when they hear AI. So doing some education around that, understanding limitations, understanding risks, and how we might intervene with that and how validation is done is probably an important part of that cultural acceptance.
All right. Well, I want to thank Liz and congratulate her again. It's really thought-provoking, great talk. Thank you.